The floor will be given to Professor Helene Uiltveit-Moe.
That's the last slide. I need the first one. Thanks. So let me start by saying thank you very much for inviting me to this inauguration. I'm very happy to be here. I'm in particular very happy to be here because you are filling this chair with a fantastic person. And I'm as lucky to have known him since both of us were much younger, so we have known each other for 25 years. And I find it's kind of telling, given that the topic today is European studies, that it was, in particular, it was due to European research funds institutions, that meant that we actually met many years ago. And I want also to add that I think the only good thing that came out of Brexit is probably Gianmarco Deviano being willing to return to Bocconi. So at least one good to take along. I'm going to talk about alternatives to EU membership, and in particular then about the Norwegian model. So the Norwegian model was, until Brexit, something that only Norwegians actually cared about. With Brexit, things changed quite a lot. With Brexit, in particular, UK journalists started to call us and wanted to kind of understand what the Norwegian model actually is. And I think, given now after years of discussion of Brexit and of different types of associations with the EU, I think we have a few lessons that we can kind of bring to the table when it comes to kind of what it's like with other type of associations than full EU memberships. And that's what I'm going to say a few words about today. So for those who don't kind of understand the difference in colors here, so the green colors on the map, those are kind of, they tells you that these are the EEA countries, which will be an essential part of my talk. So it's Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. In many EU maps, Sweden has a long coastline, but I kind of took the liberty to then include Norway instead. So in order to understand why there is a Norwegian model, I think it's worthwhile to just kind of give you a very brief kind of review of Norwegian history. So for the last kind of 600-700 years, we have been ruled by our neighboring countries. And I think that is very much part of the explanation for why we then ended up, or not me. I was old enough to kind of vote in the second referendum, not in the first one. But I think it's part of the story why Norway then voted down joining the EU, first in the 70s and again in the 90s. So lots of Norwegians felt that no, after having struggled to kind of get rid of the Danish and the Swedes, we are not going to let Brussels then be in charge instead. So this was not a referendum like the UK one on immigration and globalization. There were other topics that were kind of brought to the table, both from kind of the pro side and from the con side. Well, some of those are still very much kind of relevant for the discussion, as lots of these points are points that Gianmarco just kind of touched upon in his talk. We have this thing about kind of solidarity, we have this thing about democracy. One thing that I find is a kind of curiosity here is that, so for those that were pro-EU membership, solidarity with poorer European neighbors were important. For those who were against EU membership, solidarity with further away than poorer countries were more important. But anyhow, sovereignty and cultural identity was a very important part. So the Norwegian model then came to be established. And the Norwegian model is a model that means that we are neither inside nor outside. So our relationship with the EU is governed by a set of agreements. The most important one is the EA. And the EA was then negotiated between the EFTA countries and the EU countries, not at that point still yet called EU, but still, in the period 1989 to 1992. So it was signed in 92 and went into force in 1994 at the same time as Norway had a referendum. But it should be said, and that is kind of interesting, thinking about Great Britain, that as it was negotiated because it was thought to be a temporary agreement. It was only thought to be there for some years before the countries in question would enter the EU. And it said that it's the only reason why it actually the negotiations were successful was due to the fact that Jacques Delors, the president of the European Commission at that point, had a soft spot for our prime minister, which was our first female prime minister, called Gro Harlem Brundtland. So I think that Theresa May's problem is that today is that there are no one in Brussels that actually have a soft spot for her. So I think it will be harder for her to negotiate a similar deal. So this is just a way of showing that, so it exists, our relationship is based on a set of agreements. And as you can see, it has increased over time. It's very dynamic. It has led to a situation where Norway is, despite being outside, we are three-quarter member. We have incorporated then EU legislative acts into Norwegian legislation. We have incorporated it into approximately 1/3 of all Norwegian statutes and regulations. So the consensus in Norway, or at least by those who then have some knowledge of the topic, is that we are far more integrated in the EU than most people, both in Norway and in other countries, realize. But it is a very unusual form of relationship because it's an association, it's not a membership. And until Brexit, it was a model that hadn't been discussed by any other country, as I started out mentioning. But it is also a fact that the Norwegian authorities, over these 20, 30 years, they have not wished to, they have not wanted to isolate Norway from an ever closer and more binding integration with the EU. So, what is the EA? It's kind of fascinating to read newspapers about Brexit and EU association models, because there are a set of misconceptions out there when it comes to what is actually the EA. So the EA brings together the EU and 3 out of 4 EFTA countries. It is, in essence, an international agreement that means that we are fully members of the single market. So it covers the four freedoms: free movement of capital, labor, capital, labor, services, and good. It covers, importantly, the competition and state aid rules. It covers lots of other horizontal policies, also flanking policies. And it is, importantly, and this is where I find that it's one of these things that is really important to emphasize, that it is a dynamic agreement, and it has to be so, because the single market is also a dynamic institution. It is constantly developed, and therefore an association agreement on the single market also has to be developed gradually as the directives kind of develop the single market further. There's many things that the EEA is not. It does not cover common agriculture and fishery policies, and it is not a customs union. It does not have common trade policy, and it is also does not cover direct and indirect taxation, in particular the EU VAT system. So, I'm going to give you some of the kind of bullet points from the so-called EA review that we had in 2012. So in 2012, the government decided that they wanted to review how the agreements with the EU were working. So again, these were quite a few years before the Brexit, but the Norwegian government wanted a review. It should be said that they wanted a review, but they did not want a comparison to any other models, which was in a way telling for the type of debate. The main message that came out of this was that it is a well-functioning national compromise. And I think that that might be a lesson that could be, that it's important to take along for small countries that are not yet EU members. But I think that the type of national compromise that it embodies wouldn't work for a big nation like the UK. And that boils down to the fact that there are a set of inherent structural tensions and problems here. So despite those, it has worked much better than expected. But I think that that very much has to do with the country size. It's also so that there has been large economic benefits, but there are significant democratic deficits, since we are only allowed to adopt policies without being able to influence the policies and not allowed to be part of the decision-making processes. It also means that it has been harder over this period to actually hold the government accountable for its European policy, because it becomes less visible. It's more about lobbying that is actually about voting. But what it's also telling is that the attitudes towards membership and the EA shows that they are still mixed, but if anything, they are strong towards the EA, and if anything, kind of the tendency towards doing an EU full membership instead is absolutely not there. And if anything, the opinion has moved a bit away from that. It's a bit depressing, and I find that I think that this is telling not just for Norway, but also for other countries in Europe, how people see EU's contribution. So, although more than 35% find that it's positive, there are almost the same share think that it's neither positive nor negative, which I think it's due to pure ignorance. And then there is quite a few who actually think that it's negative. So there is an inherent democratic deficit here. But nevertheless, the EA, and that I think is why it has been so successful, is that it has ensured a stable and predictable framework for relationships with the EU, which is Norway's most important trading partner. Just having a look at the numbers shows where Norway is sending its exports. It's all about the EU. It's not about the US, and it's not about China. And it's a picture that is similar for other EA and EU countries, I dare to say. It's also much more integrated it's into the EU than many EU countries, actually, which the second graph here tells you. So this is kind of the role of trade with EU countries versus non-EU countries, and provide you with simply a ranking of then EU and EU countries. And Norway comes in red. It's with and without oil and gas, because that's the we tend to do kind of mainland and with oil and gas, because that changes the picture quite a lot. But as you can see, for instance, compared to Italy, we are far more integrated into the European trading system. And it's kind of fascinating that despite globalization and despite emerging economies, the share of trade that we have with the EA, meaning /EU, is approximately the same as in 1994. And the final thing to say, of course, is that for Norway, this has been a pretty good deal, because it's cheap. If you look at what our peers in terms of kind of finances, GDP per capita, have been paying over the same years, they have typically paid less. So I asked the EU negotiator once why they hadn't kind of asked for more. He was a bit puzzled, but they are gradually asking for more, which I think makes perfectly sense. What we have learned, which I think is interesting, is that we have been able to actually compare what it's like to be inside and outside, because we have a couple of sectors that are outside, and that are in particular agriculture and fisheries. That's one thing. So that is about kind of firms and industry that have not been covered by EA. They have suffered. They have typically suffered as they have been kind of anti-dumping accusments and the subsidies procedures, in particular against the fishery industries. So I think it would have been instructive for kind of British politicians to have a look at exactly what happens when you don't, when you leave some industries outside, as you may do if you then leave kind of services outside the new kind of agreement with the EU. Another thing that it has taught us is that non-tariff barriers matters. We are part of the single market, but we are not part of the customs union. That means that even though goods are supposed to flow instantly, the fact that we are outside the customs union means that there are customs formalities, and there means that there are VAT formalities. So I made this experiment once. I sent the same thing from the UK at that point to Norway as well as France. To Norway it took 2 weeks, to France it took 2 days, and that was simply due to border formalities. And that's the type of formalities that also Norwegian firms complain about, and which I think firms in the UK would complain about if they were not part of the customs union. What I don't think that people realize enough, and this is about both the EU and EA, is what it has actually meant for structural change. European integration has meant that, if anything, we have built in a bias in the direction, or we have built, let me say this differently. European integration has meant that it has become so attractive to trade among European countries. European countries are relatively similar. That means that there are limited gains from trade, although substantial, but at the same time, the losses for those who suffer are also smaller. So kind of trade among EU/EA countries means a smoother adaptation to specialization and less adjustment cost as compared to trade with much more different countries outside the EU. And I think that is among the things that has also served the Norwegian economy and served kind of the Norwegian population and workers well. Studies suggest that there are indeed some foregone opportunities, that we would have had more trade if we had had an EU membership, but nevertheless, we are better off if we had just had a free trade agreement and not been part of the single market, which is also something that I think is worthwhile for someone at the other side of the channel to take along. As Brexit came along, that made many of us rather nervous. The EEA agreement has nevertheless proved to be robust, both to Brexit and also to, I would say, the developments that actually triggered Brexit. But it has nevertheless meant more debate on EU. What I really find is very important is how one should think about labor migration. So, just like the UK, Norway has been very exposed to migration from the Eastern European countries, even more so than the UK in relative numbers. But we have not blamed the impact on Brussels, as then British politicians chose to do. But instead, we have kind of developed Norwegian labor market regulation as within the framework of the EA agreement, and in particular had a law that ensured the general application of collective agreements in order to then reduce the downward pressure on wages due to labor migration, which meant that we have kind of counteracted some of kind of the negative effects of labor migration on workers. And that means that we have kept low wage inequality despite migration, which is indeed kind of like, I would say, a lesson for the UK. But this is just to show that we were nevertheless a bit anxious about Brexit, in particular, since there were quite a few who didn't really think that it will have a consequence for the UK. And it's also telling that there are quite a few people who don't think it will have a consequence for Norway, even though UK is among our biggest trading partners. This is just also then to show that in terms of migration pressure, the point that I just made, I've chosen to kind of show you the numbers for 2013. They look very similar for other years, but it shows you that in terms of relative numbers, we have had 2 to 3 times as many migrants as the UK. So there are ways to kind of deal with those kind of flows, but that's not what the UK have actually chosen to do. And it's also worth kind of mentioning that it's not only about kind of tackling things in terms of economics, it's also so that when we look at the attitudes, the population's attitude towards migration, they are indeed positive. So I would like to end by saying that I found it very interesting to listen to Gianmarco's talk. I think for those of us who are kind of eager supporters of the European product, it's important to kind of support it, but also then to be clear about what is essential for it to kind of, for how to kind of maintain it as we go forward. And there are kind of 3 things that I find that, again, is what we've learned from kind of reviewing our kind of association with the EU. And that is that it is important with low inequality, it's important with high trust in government and government institutions, and it's important actually to share the gains from globalization and European integration. Only in that way are we able to then avoid irrational and damaging responses to the ongoing integration process, as we then saw in the UK. Thank you very much.